This conversation took Kevin by surprise. It was clear from his eyes, which got immediately filled with sadness and longing. For 3 months now, the man had only been able to move around on crutches, and he knew that wasn't going to change. His wife was also well aware of this fact. Unfortunately, all that Kevin's problems awoke in her were anger and irritation. That day, she went around all the rooms in the house until she found her husband in one of them. Kevin was lying on the bed and staring longingly at the ceiling. His hands and back were aching and needed rest after the strain that using crutches put on them. "Are you just going to lay there? Don't you feel the need to at least get up and greet me?" Rebecca said defiantly. Kevin looked at his wife in surprise and tried to get up immediately. All the man had been doing lately was trying to please his wife. Kevin acted as if it was his fault and that he was in a car accident and lost his health. But Rebecca seemed to enjoy the scenario of her husband feeling guilty and asking for her forgiveness all the time. Instead of helping him, she constantly put Kevin down, pointing out his inferiority and helpless position. The man courageously endured her bullying, knowing full well that pregnant women needed all the understanding in the world. Rebecca was 3 months pregnant, but she acted like she had countless kiddos who all required her attention all the time. Kevin stoically endured all the nitpicking and mockery, but what Rebecca had in store for him that day was impossible to accept. The thing was that his wife didn't come home alone. As if to humiliate Kevin even more, Rebecca brought a young man home who looked and behaved like he was her lover. "This is Josh. He'll be staying with us for a while," the woman said through clenched teeth. "He's going to what?" Kevin asked in a trembling voice. "He's going to live with us. He's part of my family now," Rebecca said with an emphasis on the word family. It was simply too much, and Kevin knew that he couldn't just take it anymore. "What family? What are you talking about? I'm your husband. You're having my baby." Rebecca's face broke into a wicked smile. "Your baby? It's not your baby. Also, he's rich and he can afford to buy whatever I want," his wife chuckled. At first, Kevin thought that he must have misheard his wife and that his mind was playing tricks on him. But then, when the man looked into Rebecca's eyes, he realized that everything she just said was true. And the young man standing next to his wife was definitely real. Kevin's eyes filled with tears, but of course he wasn't going to cry in front of his cheating wife and her lover. Instead, he grabbed his crutches and hobbled to the door, gritting his teeth in pain. At the same time, he tried to disregard the mocking glances of his wife and her boyfriend. Maybe he really is the baby's father, Kevin thought sadly. The man's heart was literally breaking from the unbearable pain caused by his wife's betrayal. Being a successful lawyer in the past, Kevin didn't even suspect that he would soon find himself hitting rock bottom. The man was walking deliberately slowly, trying to save energy. Kevin wanted to get out of the city, somewhere far from the traffic noises, where the air would be so clean that it would feel intoxicating. Of course, it wasn't an easy undertaking. In order not to run out of steam at the very beginning of his journey, Kevin used the services of public transportation to get out of the city. He got out at the last stop and headed for the forest by the river. He was planning on doing something he'd been thinking about for the past few weeks. But as soon as Kevin found himself under the shade of a sprawling oak, the fatigue took over him and all the bad thoughts seemed to fade into the background. Kevin's exhausted body wanted one thing and one thing only: to take a rest. Since the man didn't care about the way he looked at that point, he simply lied down on the ground, warmed by the sun, put his hands under his head, and fell asleep. Kevin dreamed of the time when he was a little boy, fooling around by the river with his friends, trying to catch a butterfly or a dragonfly. His legs were still fine back then, and life seemed simple and predictable. Kevin never slept so soundly, so he didn't even notice when a huge dog approached him. After carefully looking at the man lying in front of him, the dog came closer and licked him on the cheek. Kevin grimaced and instinctively tried to shield himself from something warm and wet and simply rolled over on his other side. "Lord, stop it! What do you think you're doing?" Someone's voice rang out. Kevin didn't want to open his eyes. The man enjoyed being in the realm of dreams where he wasn't disabled and didn't need crutches to get around. But he had to wake up because the dog's owner clearly wasn't going to leave Kevin alone. "Why are you lying here? It's going to get dark soon and you're all alone in the middle of the forest. That's not good," the stranger said. Kevin barely managed to open his eyes and saw a woman of about 70 standing in front of him. Her face seemed kind. "I'm sorry, I was just taking a walk, but then I got tired and decided to lay down," Kevin muttered and forced a smile out of himself. "Well, you had your rest, and now it's time to get up. The temperature will drop at night and you're lying on the cold ground. You could get pneumonia," the woman said. As if to confirm his elderly owner's words, the dog standing next to her barked loudly. "There you go, even Lord knows it's true," the woman said with a smile. Glancing at the dog, Kevin got up reluctantly and leaned on his crutches. "That's better. My name is Vanessa Bennett. That's Mrs. Bennett to you, son." The woman introduced herself casually. Kevin also introduced himself and winked at the dog. Vanessa turned out to be a very pleasant old woman who casually invited Kevin to spend the night at her house. "If you don't like it here, you're free to leave in the morning," the woman added. Kevin looked around and thought about it. He didn't want to spend the night in the forest. Kevin wasn't afraid of wild animals. It was something else. He was afraid of himself, or rather his deepest, best hidden subconscious desires. Therefore, Kevin didn't really feel like he had much of a choice, so he followed Mrs. Bennett and her dog, Lord. The woman deliberately walked slowly so that it would be easier for Kevin to keep up with her. Lord, on the other hand, constantly ran ahead of them to bark at the rabbits and squirrels that he occasionally came across. Finally, Vanessa's house appeared ahead. It was a 2-story building that looked at least half a century old, maybe even more. The house smelled of herbs and pine and something Kevin couldn't recognize. First of all, Vanessa escorted the guest to the bathroom, after which she began to fuss in the kitchen. Soon, Kevin had a simple dinner in front of him. Vanessa cooked scrambled eggs and bacon and made some chamomile tea. Seeing how quickly the man devoured his dinner, Vanessa immediately brought out a cherry pie and put it in front of the man. "Thank you very much. It was all delicious," Kevin said emotionally. Mrs. Bennett smiled and patted Lord's head. In all honesty, Kevin hadn't eaten anything as tasty in a very long time. The truth was that Rebecca couldn't cook to save her life, so he always ordered takeout. She believed that wasting her time in the kitchen was beneath her, and she respected herself too much to be doing that. After the guests had dinner, Mrs. Bennett made a bed for him. The man fell asleep literally in seconds. Back home, Kevin used to have insomnia, but that day he already spent nearly half a day sleeping in the forest, and now he had no problem falling asleep again. Apparently, he was exhausted, and now his body needed proper rest to recover. Kevin didn't dream about anything that night. In the morning, the man woke up to a very strange sound. At first, he couldn't even identify its source, but after listening more carefully, he realized that it was coming from the living room. It somewhat resembled music, but it was accompanied by some kind of rhythmic stomping. "Is she dancing out there?" Kevin thought to himself. But when he took his crutches and went into the living room, he saw something rather strange. Mrs. Bennett was doing gymnastics to the sound of quiet music, and Lord was there too. Of course, Lord couldn't boast of such grace as the old woman, but the dog did try to keep up, jumping almost to the very ceiling. "Join us. Why are you just standing there?" Vanessa offered with a smile. Kevin looked down at his crutches and shook his head sadly. The man understood that such gymnastics was definitely not for him. His life was now very different, and he knew that eventually he'd be stuck in a wheelchair, sadly looking through the window at people living their lives. But Mrs. Bennett had no intention of giving up. She approached Kevin and took his hand, then she threw aside his crutches. The man immediately started panicking. He felt that he would collapse at any moment, dragging the fragile old woman down with him. But Vanessa Bennett was ready for it and firmly stood on the ground. She pulled Kevin over to her training spot and made him raise his hands and spread them to the sides. She also made him use his legs. Even though he didn't have complete control over his legs, he could still move them a little. Despite the fact that the training session turned out to be quite tiring, Kevin had no choice but to keep going. Frankly speaking, he wasn't ready for such a turn of events. After all, Kevin was convinced that he wouldn't even be able to take a single step without his crutches, but apparently that wasn't so. "You see what you can do? And you were scared," Mrs. Bennett said, smiling. "Thank you. How do you know so much about all those exercises?" Kevin asked enthusiastically. "I used to be a doctor, an orthopedist, but then my husband died and I quit my job and gave up medicine," the woman explained. Kevin nodded sympathetically. He felt very sorry for this sweet woman who lived in the middle of the forest like some kind of a fairy. At breakfast, Vanessa casually tried to get Kevin to have an open conversation. The man tried to resist at first, but then he gave up and simply told Mrs. Bennett the whole truth. He spoke about having grown up in a poor family and how he dreamed of becoming successful. How he graduated from law school and decided to pursue a career as a lawyer. He liked defending ordinary citizens, making sure their rights weren't infringed upon. Kevin's career was going uphill, and if he hadn't met Rebecca, he would have probably become very, very successful. Things were going great at first. Rebecca found Kevin like an experienced predator finds its prey. The smart and devious young woman quickly saw the potential in the smart and insightful young man. It didn't take long for the couple to decide to get married, and in just 6 months, they were legally wedded. Every year, Kevin started charging more and more for his work. Soon, the man could afford to buy a nice car, not only for himself, but also for his wife. Rebecca, on the other hand, used the man's newfound wealth for her own personal purposes, and without hesitation spent his money on beauty salons, restaurants, and other entertainment. Moreover, she truly believed that it was the right thing to do and that she needed to enjoy her life while she was young. Everything changed in an instant when Rebecca got behind the wheel instead of Kevin on their way home from one of their parties. Of course, neither one of them knew that it was a huge mistake that would cost Kevin his health. Having gone over the speed limit, Rebecca lost control of the car and drove it into a ditch. Ironically, the passenger side got the worst of it, and thus Kevin got severely injured. The doctor's words came like a terrible verdict to the young lawyer: partial paralysis of the lower extremities and crutches until the end of his days. At first, Kevin didn't want to show his wife how upset he was and was determined to fight till the end. At that point, he didn't yet know that he wouldn't get any support from Rebecca. The realization was very painful. Kevin supported his wife for so many years, never once saying no to any of her requests. But now, when the once successful lawyer was in a difficult situation and needed her help, she just abandoned him. And then, at the most critical moment, Rebecca announced that she was pregnant. Of course, Kevin was very happy about this news. He even pulled himself together and got back to work. As expected, the disabled lawyer didn't get as many clients as he had before. But if he worked hard, he could still make ends meet. But Rebecca was accustomed to living a rich life, and she wasn't willing to give that up. She liked to have dinners at restaurants, just like before, as well as go to beauty salons and expensive boutiques. She was smart enough to understand what kind of life awaited her with Kevin. Rebecca didn't want to take care of her disabled husband, and therefore, she decided to take matters into her own hands. At one point, she mentioned that it would be smart for Kevin to transfer the ownership of the house and the other property to her. "It will be safer this way, dear. You have health problems, and I don't." Back then, Kevin still trusted his wife blindly, so he didn't notice the catch. Although, as a lawyer, he should have realized that it wasn't the best idea. Nevertheless, he signed all of the documents without a shadow of a doubt. Meanwhile, the lawyer looked at him as if he was truly crazy. The man couldn't believe that such a competent lawyer didn't see the trap his own wife set up for him. Kevin only realized what a huge mistake he'd made when Rebecca brought home her wealthy lover into their house and showed her legal husband to the door. Having listened to Kevin's story, Mrs. Bennett got quiet for a bit. She wasn't going to drive the guest away anyways, but after his confession, she got even more convinced that it was the right decision. As it turned out later, Mrs. Bennett also had her own problems. In fact, the woman didn't move out into this wilderness out of her own free will. She had her own reasons for it. Her problems were caused by her granddaughter, who forced the old woman to sell her house in order to pay off her student loans. I really did believe that she was going to give me part of the proceeds so I could buy a smaller house to live in. But it turned out that she had other plans," the woman said sadly. "Yes, I understand. I worked on many cases like this, defending people who ended up in situations like yours," Kevin explained. At that moment, a very interesting thought popped into his head. "Mrs. Bennett, when was the last time you saw your granddaughter? I mean, before she came to get you to sell your house," the lawyer asked. "Well, it was a long time ago, 15 years ago, no less. Her mother moved to Canada, and my son died in an accident." "Why are you asking?" the woman asked. Kevin frowned and then said, "You could have fallen victim to a scam. That woman might not even be your granddaughter, but someone who simply wanted to force you to sell the house. She probably got access to the database that lists all the single homeowners, and then she could have pretended to be your granddaughter in order to make you feel sorry for her and sell the house." Vanessa's face showed genuine surprise. The truth was that she couldn't even think that something like that could happen in real life. But Kevin knew what he was talking about and felt that he was right about it. He used to be a successful lawyer and handled many cases of this kind. It was the young lawyer who suggested that Mrs. Bennett needed to turn to the police. Before she talked to Kevin, Mrs. Bennett didn't want to get the police involved for fear of harming her granddaughter. But now, when she suspected that she was scammed, she decided to turn to the law enforcement agents. Imagine Mrs. Bennett's surprise when the investigation confirmed Kevin's suspicions. Unfortunately, Mrs. Bennett indeed fell victim to a scam, while the woman who pretended to be Vanessa's granddaughter turned out to be an experienced con artist. Sadly, they couldn't give Mrs. Bennett her house back, but the con woman was obliged to pay Vanessa compensation. "Thank you, dear. I don't even know what I'd do without you," Vanessa said with tears in her eyes. Kevin simply brushed the old woman off in response. He didn't think that he did anything special, but simply drew attention to what others didn't notice. Meanwhile, Mrs. Bennett decided to return the favor. Showing genuine concern for Kevin's health, she made him do physical therapy and gymnastics every day. She didn't forget about massage therapy either, which had a very positive effect on the man's condition. The woman believed that if Kevin strengthened the muscles of his back and legs enough, he'd be able to walk without crutches one day. At first, Kevin didn't believe in the success of the woman's undertaking and continued to exercise more out of a respect of Mrs. Bennett than anything else. However, when Kevin managed to take his first step without crutches just a month later, he realized Mrs. Bennett was right. It took Kevin 3 months to learn to walk without crutches. During this time, the man trained to the point of exhaustion every single day, overcoming more and more new challenges. 5 months later, Kevin left the house without a cane for the first time. He went to the city to pay Rebecca a visit. By that time, she was supposed to have already had the baby. However, when Kevin arrived at the place that used to be his home, he learned that the house belonged to some strangers now. Luckily, the new owners of the house gave him Rebecca's new address. Kevin immediately noted the difference between their old house and Rebecca's new one. It was a dull, one-story building that looked more like a barn than a real house. Kevin knocked on the door and was prepared to see anything but what he did. Rebecca opened the door wearing a simple dress. She had dark circles under her eyes from lack of sleep. She was very surprised to see Kevin without crutches, but she refrained from commenting on it. Instead, Rebecca led the guest into the house and showed him the crib with the baby. "This is Billy. He's a good boy, but he's got a developmental delay. I hope he'll grow out of it," the woman said, trying to keep her emotions in check. "I'm sure he will. I used to be disabled too, remember? But now I can walk on my own again. I'm sure everything will be fine with our son." The ex-husband's words brought tears to Rebecca's eyes. She thought that Kevin came to mock her, but that wasn't the case. The man was sincerely worried about little Billy, who followed him with an attentive look. Deep down, Kevin didn't care who his biological father was. In fact, the child wasn't to blame for anything, and therefore Kevin decided to help him. It was Kevin who suggested that Rebecca needed to see Mrs. Bennett so that she could give some recommendations regarding the exercises to work on with the baby. Meanwhile, Kevin didn't really think about the future. He just wanted to help his son. Eventually, they got back together with Rebecca and lived a long life full of happy moments and laughter. It was Kevin's ability to forgive that helped him give Rebecca a second chance and forget all about her mistakes and her mistreatment of him. Soon, Mrs. Bennet saw her granddaughter, as well as her great-grandson, whom she taught to walk and helped him have a happy childhood.